to academics, lawyers, and government, who is leading higher education in the 21st century. On behalf of Touro Law Center and the Touro Law Review, we are truly honored for all of those in attendance today. The goal of this symposium is to explore the rapidly evolving landscape of higher education. Traditionally, higher education has been guided by the academic community, but now it faces unprecedented legal, regulatory, and organizational challenges. This symposium brings together distinguished panels of scholars, policymakers, and industry experts to engage in scholarly discussions of why these changes are occurring and what the future may hold. This symposium would not be possible without the hard work of President Kadish, Provost Salkin, Dean Langen, Dean Citron, Professor Seplowitz, Gabby Rosenbaum, Anastasia Hagen, and Jackie Zervoli, along with all of the other members of the administration and staff who contributed to the. I also want to thank all of the panelists and moderators who'd agreed to join us today and tomorrow. And last but not least, I want to thank our sponsors, Cozen O'Connor, Thompson Coburn LLP, Higher Ed Consolidation Solutions, Jennifer Block LLP, Troutman Pepper, and Nixon Peabody. The symposium was inspired by two books. The first, May It Please the Campus, Lawyers Leading Higher Education by Touro Law Center's Provost, Patricia E. Salkin. Published in 2022, Provost Salkin's book is a multi-year study on lawyers as university presidents that goes all the way back to the 1700s. The data in this book suggests that by the end of the 2020s, lawyers will represent 10% of Carnegie classified college and university presidents. Her empirical research revealed that institutions have been increasingly reliant on lawyers as university presidents, especially during challenging times. Since the publication of Provost Salkin's book in 2022, the study has become increasingly relevant. This takes us to the second book, All the Campus Lawyers, Litigation, Regulation, and the New Era of Higher Education by Louis H. Gard and Dr. Joyce P. Jacobsen. The goal of this book is to examine the last 10 to 15 years where public universities have been in the era of new regulatory oversight, litigation pressures, increased public scrutiny, and decreased deference by the courts. Louis H. Gard and Dr. Joyce P. Jacobsen's books can help explain why we have seen this increase in lawyer university presidents. Tomorrow, we will see 4 panels. The panels will discuss the changing regulatory landscape in higher education, discrimination and higher education, changing dynamics of higher education institutions, mergers, acquisitions, and consolidations, and lastly, lawyers leading higher educations. I look forward to the lively discussions these timely and unique panels will bring. I also look forward to the many law review article submissions that will come with that as well. Tonight, our keynote speakers are Louis H. Gard and Joyce P. Jacobsen. Please join me in welcoming the moderator of their discussion. No one better than to lead this discussion than the president and the CEO of the National Association of College University Attorneys, Ona Alston Dosunmy.
Thank you so much, Alexa, and congratulations on being elected editor-in-chief. I know how hard that work is. I've got a kid who works on her own. He's not even an editor. So God bless you and congratulations. I want to thank the administration and all of your sponsors. I'm thrilled to be here and super excited to hear this presentation and hear the Q&A. So thank you and good evening. I've been asked to moderate tonight's keynote presentation, and here's how we sort of decided the evening will go. Lou and Joyce will do a presentation with some slides. I've got a question while you all get warmed up, but our sincere hope is that all of you will engage in dialogue with Lou and Joyce, and that we'll have a conversation. I am not going to belabor introductions. Lou is Vice President and General Counsel of Hobart and William Smith Colleges, and an adjunct professor of law at Cornell Law School. Dr. Joyce Jacobsen is the former president of Hobart and William Smith colleges and a current professor of economics. And I know for a fact we've got at least one other economist in the room. So the one thing I will mention about Dr. Jacobsen's work is that she's done a tremendous amount to advance women in economics, which were woefully underrepresented. In 2021, that work was recognized, and she was honored with the Carolyn Shaw Bell Award by her national association. I will let you hear from them about this book, but I will say that they have done an absolutely extraordinary job describing how higher education became highly regulated and how people like the members of the National Association of College and University Attorneys, many of whom are your in-house counsel on campuses, became integral to the higher education enterprise. So without further ado, I'll give you Joyce and Lou.
Another time. I think another time. Sorry. Yeah, thank you.
All right. There we go.
Well, it is truly amazing to be here. Thank you very much for this extremely warm welcome. Thank you, Ona, for the very generous introduction and for taking time out of your very busy schedule to be here tonight as well. And thank you to Provost Salkin, who I've said this before, but I just started working with her maybe, I don't know, 6 months or a year ago. And she's an absolute motor, just a total engine and never slows down. And so I know it's early. The symposium hasn't really started yet. I don't want to get too excited, but she's amazing and much credit is due to her for pulling this together. It's also very nice. This is surreal on another level, which is that it's 6:30 or so at night, and people are actually listening to me. I have 3 kids under 5 at home, and no one ever listens to me at 6:30 at night. So it's a pretty interesting experience. But we have a few slides. We will kick this off, kind of focused around the work of our book, which Ona referenced. And the book sort of does 3 things. It tells the story of the last 10 to 15 years at the intersection of higher ed and the law and what has happened and sort of why are we the way that we are now, right? So that's kind of aspect number 1 of the book. The second thing we try to do is tease out the ways in which the law is exerting pressure on the fundamental mission of colleges and universities. And so that's kind of point number 2. And then the third thing that we really try to do in the book is explain and interrogate the role of legal counsel in the modern college and university setting. So those are the 3 basic things that the book does. But to sort of frame some of our discussion tonight, we have this sort of funny old picture of our campus, Hobart and William Smith, to kind of give a sense of, to understand where we are today, let's think about where we came from, right? So I wrote to our college archivist and I was like, send me a picture of Hobart and William Smith in the 19th century. And he sent this back. And, it's pretty basic, right? It's a building. It's a few people in front of the building, right? And it kind of matches. Longfellow has a great description of the 19th century university as 2 or 3 brick buildings, a chapel, and a president to pray in. And so what you see in this image is actually a few brick buildings, and then to the right, our chapel, and just kind of simplicity of that time. Fast forward 100 or so years, and this is a quote from Bart Giamatti that we came across. This is a charming photo of the entire Giamatti family. I had to put the whole family in there because, of course, Paul is in there. But this is a quote from then President Giamatti, president of Yale University, where he wrote that his greatest fear for the future of higher education was that those who are responsible for the legal processes and those who are responsible for the daily life of the mind will see themselves as somehow engaged in different things. And what he meant, the more fulsome context of this quote, he wasn't necessarily just talking about lawyers, but really talking about administrators in general. He was a professor, I believe, of English literature, and so had come up through that pathway to the presidency, and so had articulated this in 1976, which we thought was kind of an interesting jumping off point to encourage readers to think about some of these issues. So, as we were kind of working on the book, Joyce had the fantastic idea of being an economist. How do we think about this? How do we put some numbers to this? I know you coming into my office and complaining every day that you're so busy is one thing, but how about we try to put numbers to it? And so what this chart is or shows is every case on Lexis and Westlaw that includes the term, that includes a college or a university as a party to the case over about 100 years, 120 years. So 1901 to 2021. And so what you see is fairly obvious, this upward curve with kind of interesting spikes at various points in time. And it's consonant with kind of the classical description that you hear of, higher ed was isolated for a long period of time until about the mid 60s when, legislation and regulation became a little more prominent and sort of started to pry open the gates to campus. And, that shift has been well documented and discussed. But I think this chart kind of shows in dramatic form, what we're here to tease out over the next day. So then we had the idea, what would this chart look like if you just mapped onto it a few pieces of a few laws, legislation, regulation, guidance that we're all fairly familiar with? What would it look like? Would it tell you anything? I don't know that it really tells you anything, but I do think it has some dramatic effect, right? So you could see some statutes that we're all very well familiar with: Title VII, Title IX, the ADA, the Civil Rights Act of 91, the Fair Pay Act, the 2012 Dear Colleague letter. I just sort of picked randomly because I think, well, not randomly, but I think it kind of kicked off what we think of today as the pendulum of Title IX regulatory activity. And it really is nicely situated at the bottom of that upward curve. So just another chart to kind of build out some of our thinking. So this, great credit is due on this slide to United Educators. I'm sure some of you are familiar with them. They're a major insurer of colleges and universities, and so they're a great bastion of data. And this is a chart that they put together that shows damage awards and settlement trends against colleges and universities, or in cases involving colleges and universities from 2015 to 2023. And again, you see that very familiar upward to the right trend, but culminating in the most recent year with 110 damage and settlement awards against colleges and universities. And then you're seeing an increasing amount for each of these as well, right? So the value of these cases is going upward. One other thing we thought might be interesting to look at, and so we pulled this from the Chronicle, is job data, right? Like, so if legal and regulatory issues have become more complicated, have colleges and universities started hiring more in-house counsel? And so one reference point we found is this chart here, which shows job listings for Office of General Counsel jobs at colleges between 2010 and 2019. So, a lot of these years are obviously not perfect, but they kind of overlap over that key period that we're talking about here. And again, you see, I think, this upward and to the right trend. Finally, here's a slide just citing some NACUA numbers. ONA's organization, NACUA, is incredibly influential in this whole space. And, you'll see that in 1985, there were 2,400 members. By 1997, they had only grown to 2,762. But then by 2022, membership had increased to 5,050, of which 3,849 are exclusively in-house counsel that work for colleges and universities. So I should probably bother someone on this. I would.
5,000.
Wow. Great. So there you go. I did want to, since you were here and since I was showing this really silly slide that so that's just, some slides we had pulled together that kind of frame some of the issues. But I will kick it over
Okay,
to Joyce.
I'm gonna go back to the one slide that we started with. And usually you say this, Lou, but you didn't this time, which is that there's basically, this building is still there, and so is the chapel. But what is now behind, you can see behind, there's almost nothing. There's just a field and farmhouse. And that's actually, if you look through that space now, there's a big administration building. So what's missing is the administration. And so Lou and I basically developed this book partly because, well, we worked together. And one day I was like, we should write a book because we know a lot of stuff by now. And he's like, oh, that's a good idea. But we also taught a course together, which we're actually teaching in the spring, on law and economics of higher education. So the book is basically the law part with a little of the economics, and then I do additional economics. But one of the big stories over this period is this rise of administration also. The fact that, again, in 1860s, you didn't need an administration building.
How could I forget that?
Yeah, I know. That's okay, because his office is in that building. So, and then around, and it was built like in 1908, but it was actually a classroom mostly at that point. And then later it became the administration building. And so that often happens also is that buildings get repurposed into administration. And so one thing we do document to some degree in the book is this rise of the non-teaching people on campus. That again, back then there were the professors and then a president who often also taught. And now, of course, it's rare presidents mostly don't teach. When I was president, I did not teach, so I taught as provost. And then later on, we start seeing this big rise in administrators. And we document at one point in this book, for instance, just how many administrators are specifically to deal with regulation. And there have been a couple of studies, not as many as you might think. There was a very good study done by Vanderbilt and one by Loyola Marymount on what percentage of the budget at a large university goes to actually dealing with the layers of regulation and or administration coming from outside the college, and calculated in both cases and separate from grant administration, which is a bigger deal at Vanderbilt, particularly with the medical school, that it's about 3% of budget at a minimum. And that's not counting the time that, say, a professor might use to do things. It's thinking more just people that are specifically hired to deal with things like data collection and reporting or Title IX administrators, et cetera. 3% of the budget, which, again, for those who know anything about current higher education finances, is pretty much, that's going to be the difference between being in the black and being in the red. We have we're getting to the point of sort of like supermarkets now in terms of profit margin, or it's not profit, but net revenue margin. So 3% is a big difference. And so the burden, particularly on smaller colleges, of having to run this overhead is not insignificant, and is part of if you look at operating budgets of colleges, if they were just teaching, they'd break even. But once you start adding on these other levels, that's where they go net negative. And that's what's really an issue, I think, also. Now, again, this isn't just for the industry of colleges and universities that this is an issue, but it's something I think that we'll talk about this probably later, of why this is particularly worrisome for this industry. And I use that term in kind of the technical economic sense. I think the other thing we wanted to talk about, the book goes through the different areas of what matters in terms of, again, the triple threats of regulation, legislation, and litigation. And we go through civil rights acts in particular. We talk about free speech, which is interesting because of what isn't covered and what people think is covered. We have a chapter on governance. We have a chapter on sort of the revenue sources, admissions, advancement, and also community relations. And then one chapter, which I thought was actually going to be the boring chapter to write, on student affairs. And it turned out really to be the most interesting chapter in many ways, because we really saw these swings of the pendulum of how people view colleges and universities and the level of trust associated with them. So while much of the book deals with this post-2012 period, and Lou kind of underplayed a little bit again, the key issue here of the Dear Colleague letter, we really do take that as the beginning of this modern period of higher levels of scrutiny, and that it's just increased since about 2012. So obviously, again, some of this is earlier, but there's also these earlier waves of how student affairs are managed. So in, say you go back to like the 30s and 40s, it's an in loco parentis period. So colleges and universities are acting as parents, particularly for women on campuses. So women are basically locked in dorms and they're only released out for dates and not much else to go to class. And so then, and the colleges took care of them. And then there was this wonderful period, which was actually when I went to college in the late 70s and early 80s, when nobody paid any attention to kids at all. It was really great. They were all worn out from raising, as I say. It's at the end of the baby boom. The parents are worn out. I mean, my high school was pretty much like that too. And so, as I always say, nobody visited in 4 years. No administrator ever went to my room. And I think we would be hard pressed to find a student at Hobart and William Smith now who could say that, including we didn't even have an RA or anything like that. So there was this much lower level of scrutiny, sort of a golden era. The drinking age was lower then too. So when I started college, drinking age was 18 in Massachusetts. So again, a lot of sort of the issues on campus of maintaining students weren't there. Then the drinking age goes up, a number of other things happen. And now we argue we're in a third period where we've swung back to in loco parentis. And so there's this very high level of scrutiny of what students are doing 24 hours a day for residential colleges, because basically a lot of what we do as residential colleges is rent space for students. That's actually one of our main money makers now, is renting fully depreciated buildings like we just saw. In fact, that building at Hobart is a dormitory now. So as you imagine, since it was built by 1860, it's fully depreciated. But now people don't trust the colleges and universities to make the right decisions. So it's in your parents, but there's people looking over your shoulder and telling you how to be parents. And that wasn't true in the earlier era. And so that's the pendulum swing and this additional layer on it. And I think the interesting question is, will we swing back again? Will we swing back to a different version of what I experienced in the 70s and 80s? And what would that look like? And do we get to that phase? And how soon do we get to it? But we are definitely in the high regulation phase. And even things just since we turned in the manuscript, we turned the manuscript in November 2023, and then everything changed even then. We had one sentence on Title VI in our manuscript. And as you might, that was like one of the main themes from last year. Also, all of the dismantling of the DEI offices and general regulations, that all happened. So actually, along with Patty, we've written a follow-up article just dealing partly with all the things that happened since we turned in the book. Luckily, this fall has been calmer. So we haven't had to update for this fall as much because everybody's just sitting waiting to see what's going to drop. But there was really a lot over the last year. And so this floodgate of keeping up and Lou's day-to-day job of keeping up with all these things that are happening is just crazy. And again, it's been a little calmer now in terms of not new stuff coming out. But again, we're just waiting to see what happens next. So one big question is, what's next? We're in this era now of increased regulation. Does that continue, or do we see a rollback? Will this be part of a general rollback in regulation? We don't know the answer to that. We do some prognosticating in the book of what things we think will start mattering even more in the future. We may be right or wrong on some of those. But we do know this is like a really interesting area to work at. I think Lou will tell you certainly that his job is very interesting because as a general counsel, you're across so many different fields every day. You have to think about, what do I do in-house? What do I go out? How do I supervise the out? And as a former president and provost, the number of things that came across my desk that I never thought of as somebody who came up through the academic ranks, that so much of my time would be spent basically with general counsels, first at Wesleyan, where I was dean of provost, and then subsequently at Hobart, that I basically become best friends with the general counsels. And I didn't see that coming as somebody, even from a field like economics, that is relatively tied to law. And I had worked as a consultant, et cetera. But I didn't see that, and I should have seen that coming. And that's, I think, what has led to this book and our attempt to document the whole field of all the areas on campus where law has now become basically that Lou has to be called in to deal with what's going on. So I think we'll stop there. Turn it back over to Ona, see if she wants to kick off anything else. again, thank you for your attention to this point. So.
I have so many questions, and I will just note, you had your chart, and you kind of put the cases, and then you put what was happening in terms of the regulatory environment. And last week, court threw out the 2024 Title IX regs, and so schools now all have to revert back to their 2020 Title IX regs as an example of sort of the challenges of practicing in this space. So do you all want to start with an easy question or a hard question?
Medium.
What? So I'll ask you what I asked when we sort of got together to organize this conversation. And I do hope that folks in the audience will ask questions, and I think you could just raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. But I sort of said, is this just a case of higher education catching up to essentially every other industry, as you use the term, in the country? And if in fact that's true, what does it mean?
Sure. Yeah, I'll go. Yeah, we'll take turns going first. So, can we teach together? So, I think that is true. Partly it is that it's just catching up. And so other industries have certainly labored under higher levels of regulation in many ways and been trusted less. And just today, they got rid of red dye number 3. So, there's a lot going on in any industry. And I do think that we were given more of the benefit of the doubt for many years as eradicated. And think on the other hand that we do think it matters more here, particularly I think in areas like issues of free speech or diversity, equity, inclusion, of this idea again that we don't know what's best. And as we start out the book also, that we are doing something, we're not just selling hamburgers or pencils, we're shaping minds. And that does seem like a different, even though I use the term industry, a different thing to be doing than say manufacturing of crayons. So I think in that sense, we're more worried about it because it has large implications, not only on how the workforce is created and educated, but how people are created and educated. And that's different fundamentally. And then we were used to be treated differently because we were doing this, what was seen as a very fundamental and important thing. And now we're not treated that way. That is a big change.
Yeah, I know all of what Joyce said, actually. It's something that I'm starting to think about a lot more recently. I do think that the trend line mirrors a lot of other industries. And I think if you look at like cases in the federal court system involving Title VII, the chart would look very similar anyway. And so that's obviously inclusive of all different types of industries, right? It's any defendant in those cases, right? But to Joyce's point about higher ed being different, one of the things I tell my law school seminar at the beginning of the year is that I love studying this because you're studying laws that shape the places that shape our future. That's how I really try to think about the study of the law of higher education. And so I think, that is why we are a little different, right? Because we're not making hot dogs, we're not making widgets. We're literally shaping minds, people that will go out and participate in our democracy, and it's fundamental to the engine that runs our society, right? So we're different in that respect. And then I heard a great quote recently that part of the purpose of law is to translate strong emotions or sharp emotions into concrete outcomes, into sort of real concrete things. And so that got me thinking about, what are the emotions that are driving a lot of increased regulatory pressure as it pertains specifically to higher education? And is it really like plaintiffs out there who are really agreeing political pressures or societal shifts? And so those are two things that I've kind of started thinking about related to that.
So that's a great segue to a tougher question. Uh, I don't think anyone would, argue that our society and our culture is significantly more polarized today than it has been in easily a generation. I won't say ever, because anytime you say ever, you hear about folks back in the day when they actually had fistfights on the floor of Congress. It hasn't quite degenerated to that point yet, but campuses aren't immune to that politicization and polarization. So how does that impact how higher ed counsel do their job, and how does it complicate the picture that you're painting in your book?
That is a hard question, Ona. Come on. That kind of gets me thinking about what is the job of higher ed legal counsel. And I think job number one is you have to give legal advice. So the law says what it says. And we all know, everybody in this room knows that, especially in some of the statutes and guidance that we deal with, sometimes that's very clear. You must have a Title IX coordinator. Sometimes it's not very clear, severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive. People can disagree about what that is, and they do. I approach my work as a general counsel through the lenses of legal advice, strategy, policy, and institutional values. And those are kind of the four lenses that I feel like I'm applying kind of on a daily basis. And those lenses vary in prescription strength, to torture the analogy, depending on kind of the problem or the issue that the institution happens to be dealing with and that I'm trying to provide advice on. So I do find that in those moments where the law is not so clear and that lens is maybe not quite as useful, going to the values lens, that filter, is ultimately where things land, right? What can the institution, what path are they going to take where folks can sleep at night knowing that it was the right thing to do? That's kind of where I ultimately gravitate when I'm in those kinds of situations. I don't know if that got to your question or not, but
let me try it from the administrator angle more. So I guess one of the big issues when presidents get together and talk is always, when do you speak publicly on issues and when you don't? And this comes up all the time still. And so there has been kind of more of a movement now of some presidents or some colleges and universities saying, we are going to take a stance of neutrality. And of course, Chicago is the most famous to come up with a stat, and other schools have signed on specifically to the Chicago one. So we're going to stay neutral and not comment on anything. But the discussion has also become more nuanced lately on, well, is that basically letting down the side also? If you never comment on anything, then you're never taking a statement. Are there things that you should take a statement on? So I think that is a really difficult thing, because if you start doing too many, then people say, well, you talked about this, but you didn't talk about that. I remember my former boss, Michael Roth, the president at Wesleyan, once he used to blog regularly, he still does to some degree, posted about the tragedy of a bombing in Paris. And he was a French scholar. And people wrote back and said, well, you didn't post when there was a bombing in Lebanon last week. So once you start posting more, then it can suck you down that road. On the other hand, do you really want to go to the other extreme and never comment on anything? And I mean, David knows this also as a former member of the New York Six presidents. We sometimes even as a consortium said, this is something that we should jointly speak on. And there were some issues related to immigration in particular. So are there just things that we talk on because it is part of our industry again, and these are public moves that we see as problematic for our industry? Because under the neutrality, you wouldn't even talk then. And then what do we see as relevant to our industry? We have a large dump in upstate New York near us, and I was pressured constantly that
thanks,
college,
New York City.
Yeah. Yes.
It was a joke.
And we're actually we're downwind from one of them and upwind from the other. So it depends what day it is. So then should the college take a stance against the dump, because there's a big, whether we continue using or not. On the other hand, we were also taking money from the company running the dump to help finance one of our research institutes. So again, do you make that stance or not? So in that case, I didn't. But then, there were alums that were very upset we weren't taking a stance on that. So how do you decide when to talk and when not to talk? And I think that has gotten more difficult for presidents and other leaders because of the politicization. And that everything you say is scrutinized to see what the partisan aspect is. And this came up a lot during the COVID period last year. There was nothing that presidents could say in many cases that could satisfy everybody or even anybody in any case. And Title IX is like that. Usually nobody's happy after a Title IX case. You don't make anyone happy. So what do you do in those situations of having to do that and how you deal with that issue? I think also as a faculty member, I also think a lot about the concern of what people can or can't say on campus. And one of the big problems with the Title VI issues was the overlap with free speech. And on the one hand, pressure coming from the Department of Education and the Department of Justice to look into Title VI violations, but also the fear that that was silencing voices on campus. And without clear guidance of the type that one would hope for someone like Blue to be able to advise on, how you navigate those paths. So I think that is the real challenge now, is because everything's gotten so politicized, there's no room for grace or for mistake. You can't really just say, I'm sorry, I got that one wrong. People call for your head. And how do we, again, get the pendulum to swing back away from that world to one where there is more grace, more ability to say, okay, I may not have done that correctly, but try to use it as a teaching moment even, and say, here's how you try to parse this out. And often people aren't interested in campus on hearing that. So much as I would like to use administrative issues as teaching moments, that isn't always possible either. And sometimes that's the most discouraging part of all as an academic, is when students and faculty don't actually want to learn from what's going on.
Thank you for that response. I am now going to look at all of you. I'm sure that someone has a question, and I invite you to ask it at this point. Economist friend.
She said, my economist friend. Yeah. So my question is, we saw a lot of the positive statements about what's happening with administration and with the legalization of higher education. We're seeing what's happening. What are the normative recommendations? Do we think that, do we dislike the direction that we're moving in? And what would you recommend colleges and universities do differently moving forward?
We do in this book, and some people have said, we'd like you to have taken a stronger stance. You try to walk the middle and not say that we will either side on a political basis, or that all regulation is bad. In fact, there are specific cases we mentioned where we think actually the regulations would be better. There are a number of the antitrust actions, for instance, that again, as a professional economist, I actually think were the right thing to do, but they do have repercussions. So I think we have really much more about how do you navigate in this changing system. And part of it is an argument about preventative law, and that one of the crucial roles of general counsel is to see things coming and think about how to avoid. But we do take kind of a more pragmatic approach on it in the book.
No, I think as a normative matter, a lot of the things, the areas in which we are being, higher ed institutions are being regulated, I think people generally, those are good things, like anti-discrimination. People, I think by and large, are in favor of that, right? It's all sort of in the details of how, what are the mechanisms that are in place to enforce those protections and afford those protections. Are they the most effective for both for the party, seeking the protection and the that's kind of what we try to grapple with. But I think we don't engage kind of in the debate so much around do we like these laws at the top level or not.
Right, and one of our points is sort of this lack of clarification on some, which I think was the main problem of 6 issues last year. We're not getting clear guidance, so then colleges are more likely to make mistakes in the sense that we saw, for instance, in the first phases of Title IX, because we're not clear how to do things, and so we're going to naturally make mistakes. And how do you avoid that in sort of a system structure rather than saying that we think at some level that we would like to see college and universities have more discretion. Again, in some ways, perhaps. They want to do diversity, equity, inclusion, action. Sense. That one seems more. Should colleges be allowed to have legacy admissions or not? California just banned those in private schools as well as public. That's, there are pros and cons. That's one of the topics the kids in our class usually find the most interesting, like because some of them are legacy. So, I think there's ways to argue these. And so they're kind of teaching moments too. I mean, again, the things that students often find the most interesting in our class, those issues about how to deal with issues of athletes, like transsexual athletes. These are issues the students are dealing with on a daily basis. It's not obvious what the answer is, but for them to be able to start laying out what are the arguments on each side, to be able to have a reasonable discussion in class of the pros and cons, just like we do in law school and economics graduate school. That's part of the goal, is use these as teaching moments without us saying what should happen. Yeah.
And I will just chime in, if I may, from the sidelines and say, you talked about the absence of grace and not being given, certainly, I'll say folks in Washington and folks in state capitals, the chance to say, oops, we got it wrong. Let's fix it. To state the obvious, a lot of folks on both the left and the right, I think, find it convenient, score points by criticizing higher education. That's something that my colleagues and I are really talking about. There are critiques coming from both the left and the right, and to your point, no one's happy. Another question: you all don't want to hear from me? All the way in the back.
Thank you. We saw, I think at Columbia University, the prominent alums using the purse string to influence certain behaviors. Is that isolated, or is that a trend now in higher education? And do you think on a societal level, it's just a norm because basically a lot of people think that money talks and values and morals is really not that important?
It's a really great question. I mean, I think alums who give money have always, but those interests tended to have been more circumscribed in the past, not as obvious. It might have been something like, we want a different coach for the football team. Not completely politically correct relative. And so sometimes schools would say no, and say, no, we have a higher principle, and other times they would bend and say yes. I think the fact that this has come out in the open, in some ways is kind of good that maybe everybody now realizes this is going on, but that it does say to colleges, how much are you willing to in for money? Because this is a lot of money we're talking about for some of these endowments. I mean, they had an off year, but then they were okay anyway because they made lots of money on their investments. So, it's a lot of money. And it's funny, as somebody who doesn't have that much money, it's like, why do they even need my paltry amount anymore? So, but also, do you have any say then as just a normal alum even in what's going on in your college? So it's the same issues we're seeing in society as a whole, that money does talk more. And that it's interesting, though, that some alums have felt even so empowered as now to try to take down presidents in a way that they were probably a little more subtle or didn't demand quite as clearly before, even if they were thinking it.
I think it's an interesting topic to actually research, like for more, bring possibly an article out or something, because I don't think the notion of people in a philanthropic organization or in a nonprofit organization saying, I'm going to withhold my support if you don't. I don't think that's new. That can't be new. I think there's some older, 19th century even examples of that. I can't recall them specifically now, but I wonder if the kind of like PR warfare that people are willing to engage in to tax sitting presidents, college presidents, if that's not a new thing. I think that I feel that is more recent and a new phenomenon. Which is, different from saying I'm going to withhold my support, but actually, putting a semi truck with, some message on the side of it and driving it around. That's kind of new.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I was just thinking, our own school, we were Hobart and William Smith colleges. And what happened was Hobart was a men's college. And at one point they were low on money as usual. And they went to a local nurseryman, William Smith, who's actually a spiritualist. So it's the only college founded by a spiritualist, which I think is funky. And he was also but he was friends with a lot of the suffragists that were in upstate New York. And so he told his friends, hey, they came and asked me for money for Hobart. And his suffragist friend said, you don't give the money for that. You give the money so they start a women's college. And so they did that. And so they took the money and they started a women's college. So there's a great, because the potential donor said, no, we're doing it this way instead. And they took the deal. So I think there's always been plenty of that going on, some of which we didn't always see, plenty of attempts to get rid of presidents, et cetera. But the amounts of money are clearly larger now, and because these endowments have the amount of money that colleges like Harvard are generating of the endowment, which is also why, of course, we're now seeing more calls for taxes on these endowments as well.
Maybe for the economist.
Wait, I think we're recording, which is why I'm going to
Okay.
pause for the mic.
So there's a lot of pressure and a lot of political rhetoric on the cost of higher education. You put up a slide and you talked about imagine the new administration building and how the administration has grown, and that's a significant cost in higher education. Then you put up a slide that showed the exponential increase in the number of reported cases, not settled cases, which is a whole other area. And what's the cost benefit analysis of this increased regulation in higher education? And is that what's driving up the cost of tuition and government's complaining about what government's doing? Maybe.
Yeah, I do think that the reason why college costs more now, because of course teaching really isn't pretty much teaching the same way. I mean, there's obviously different things I tell them, but the fundamental aspect of me walking into a room where we still have chalkboards that we have and imparting knowledge to people isn't really very different from the 19th century or even the 18th century. So what is different is, again, sort of 24/7 service that, of course, when Hobart first started, they didn't even have dormitories. They just stayed with local families, et cetera. Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first doctor who went to Hobart Medical School, just stayed in a local. So we have added this 24/7 service, and people have come to. So when you look at our budgets now, I mean, well, most of the budget isn't things that would have been there in the 19th century. So sure, that's what's driving it. It's not the labor costs of the faculty. It is the labor costs of the administration side. And I mean, as somebody who's been an administrator also, I'm sometimes just amazed at the amount of spread of what colleges are. I think at a college like Touro, it's different. You don't have as many residential students. It's a different world, but residential colleges are expected to provide so much now, partly because the rest of the world doesn't provide it. So we provide 24/7 mental health care. Why is that? Well, partly because the country doesn't provide it. And so we are providing a high level, which again, for small schools is probably not a sustainable outcome. So we're going to see a big shakedown because there are significant economies of scale in higher education. You only need one president of a university, for instance. So whether you're 1,000 or we're about 2,000 or you're 20,000, it's one president. There's obviously other people under that, but there are big economies of scale. And so I just don't see that we're in a future now where many colleges under 1,000 students are going to be surviving for much longer. It's just too expensive. Is that bad or good? It's a different thing we're producing. So we are producing a very different product now than we were producing in the 19th century. Even though we engage in is actually pretty much the same. Who's an econ major?
We are coming up on 7:30, but I definitely want to give, if there are other questions in the, got one. And I'm going to look for our organizers. Is 7:30 a hard stop? Yeah, okay.
Thank you, sir. I'm just curious the extent to which you all think that the legalization of higher education sort of, we've seen in the last few years in particular, particularly at the federal level, policies that are inching beyond management of funds flow and into, program length and promoting, with maybe good intention metrics, maybe nudging institutions towards offering certain kinds of programs over others because of the economic benefit to students, et cetera. And so in my mind, that begins to represent the legalization element and the regulatory element, moving beyond funding programs and safety and discrimination and even into the realm of the academic. And so my question is the extent to which you all think that the legalization of higher education, this trend, threatens the academic culture at the heart of traditional higher education.
I'm glad we got that question in.
Great question. I mean, in some sense, we've been doing that for a long time, though. I mean, think about the land grant universities. I mean, basically the entire sort of ag econ area, the agricultural schools are all funded because the government thought it was important that we fund those things. And comprehensive state universities, particularly the land grant ones, are basically there with a different mission than the original colleges that were created in this country. Of course, the original colleges like Harvard were created basically for clergy, was to create a class of educated people that would go out and be clergy people, clergy men in particular. So I think there's always been, there's this sort of this ivory tower view of colleges, which again, I come as a child of academics who are very unworldly. My father studied Native American languages, he was a linguist, and my mother studied Near Eastern languages. So they are this narrow world where there's this ability to have the freedom to study whatever you want, no matter how crazy or impractical it is. But that was always such a small part of what colleges and universities did. So the idea that we become more professional or pre-professional or more occupational, maybe a little bit, but there was always that there. And there was always funding directed. I mean, the very fact that there's more funding directed towards the hard sciences and the biological sciences now than ever was to the humanities. So there's always been those biases. What is interesting, though, is, as we talk about in the book, actually, is this pressure by the government to present data on the returns to education. And that wasn't there before. So there wasn't this idea, it's like, I'm investing this amount of money, and then I'm going to get this rate of return. And the government is putting out these statistics. So that must be what we're all actually thinking this is about. And I think that sort of level, which a measurement and saying this is what matters, which was always there. But the more you put attention on that, the less you have the other thing anymore. So there's always been this balance between them, and it's changed over time. And I think that's the one thing that's really interesting now is this data collection and the government basically saying this is an investment in your vocational, which has basically killed off all the art schools already.
I do think your question gets to kind of a new, I think there's going to be a wave of this, right? Or like we're on the cusp of really seeing what testing the limits. And one area that immediately comes to mind is these laws and regulations that are banning DEI or critical race theory in the classroom. I mean, I can't think of it in any other terms than a content-based restriction. When you say, if there's a state law that says you will not teach critical race theory, how is that not just content-based restriction, right? So, and I think we're going to see that played out and litigated and see where that goes. And I think that's all yet to be determined. But yes, I do feel like there is an encroachment on the academic core, and that's one example, and may not be the only example in the future.
From where I sit, I agree. That's not a very cheery way to end this conversation. I invite you to share any final thoughts, if you have any that you'd like to, anything we didn't touch on that you want to get out.
Something cheerier. Well, one cheery thought is, I think for the students in the room, that this is probably a growth area to go into higher education law. Even in an era where, I mean, I do think we're just starting now on the demographic cliff. It hasn't, this year is still a high year. It's going to be a lot different 10 years from now. That said, and even with my dislike of over administratingness, I think that there's going to be more role for lawyers, not less. And so certainly as a career area.
She said a cheering.
It's cheery for me.
Cheery for me. That means more members.
Putting your membership numbers up. So that's the cheery part, I guess I can see. But I do think the pendulum will shift back. I think there will be a push at one point saying exactly what Lou is worried about. It's not just the nudges of saying what we're going to give money for and finance, and we're going to have this, but this outright banning of some topics. I think that will start to backfire at some point. It will go too far and it will backfire, but may take a while to get there.
Yeah, outright banning, and I mean, I think there's still a lot to be done in the whole area of academic freedom. I think academia as a whole needs to kind of figure out a 2025 conception of academic freedom. I think that's a growth. That is an appreciative future project that somebody can aspire to, but
like the AAUP, maybe.
It directly goes to the academic core. But no specific closing comments other than to say thank you again for having us, and am inspired by this room and all the great people from Touro that I've met in planning this. So thank you.
Please join me in thanking them.